Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Williams, Library Services Coordinator, and welcome to the Copper Queen Library virtual programs. I am just so excited to welcome Diana Marie Delgado to this series. Diana was actually scheduled last year in April during Poetry Month, April 2020, and that was postponed. So we are just so lucky to have her now. And also, just that poetry, while April is a wonderful month to focus on poetry, I am one of the believers in making poetry a part of your daily life and your daily activities, and to really embrace this form, this literary form, and the power of a poem and how it can affect you and open you up to looking at the world around you and experiences in a way that I don't think any other medium uh, really captures the same way a poem does. So, this is Diana's first book, Tracing the Horse. And this book was also Diana, along with two other poets, was chosen for a panel at the Tucson Festival of Books last year that unfortunately was canceled at that decisive moment when everything shut down. So um, such a shame for those authors, especially the new authors. This is just a wonderful book, and I do have a date with Diana in person so she can autograph it for me and the inside. And I'm going to read from the back because I really love what this says. Set in Southern California's San Gabriel Valley, Diana Marie Delgado's debut poetry collection follows the coming of age of a young Mexican-American woman trying to make sense of who she is amidst a family and community weighted by violence and addiction. With bracing vulnerability, the collection chronicles the effects of her father's addiction and her brother's incarceration, asking the reader to consider reclamation and the power of the self. And it is such a personal story, and yet it is a story that I think for so many of us, because of our own personal challenges or stories in our own lives, becomes a universal story. And that kind of connection, Diana, I think is what is so powerful about this book, both your story, but a story that reaches us all. So welcome to the Copper Queen Library, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison, for inviting me to the Copper Queen Library, and also for just your kind words about my book. I was also sad that things were canceled, but I'm happy to be here today to read from my book, and also just to chat a little bit at the end in case anybody has any questions. I'm going to start with some of the earlier work that I created around the book. When I first began writing the book, I didn't know really that I was writing a book per se. I just wanted to write some poems about some experiences that I had growing up. But this is probably one of the first poems that I wrote where I thought, wow, I think that this is part of a theme that I'm creating. And that poem is "The Sea is Farther Than Thought." The sea is farther than thought. In church, the boys have so much light, plants grow toward them. My aunt handed me an organdy fan and said, hold this if you're frightened or want to lose yourself. The devil can dance like a goddamn dream. There are three things on earth to point to: the sun, the moon, and the television. I can locate one of these. My brother walked into a garage with the needle taped to a battery and emerged with his entire stomach tattooed. I don't think I'll touch a face like that again. Across the street, wetbacks sleep 5 to a room and sweep and water their dirt while children send canoes without oars down the Hudson. Let me explain westward expansion. Snow unfolded over a wagon train of 9 and nothing without wings survived. The sea is farther than thought. He answered the door holding a rag to his neck, and we kissed on the service porch near a pit bull that had just won a fight. Sometimes my father whittles for my mother in front of a bonfire, the vein searching his thigh Corinthian blue. To be honest, I called because there was snow in my glove, not because I missed you. If the original tunnel of the body is the mouth, I've never had one. As a girl, I kept suede horses and a hairbrush inside a blonde toy box. One day, my face will refuse to turn away. Some people like poison. I kneeled every time I opened it. "12 trees. The plumes of the avocado are sick. Dad cuts roses with a hatchet. In hell, there's nothing but crocodiles and fathers. In Mexico, the devil is handsome and smiles in all his photographs. He has one wife, 2 daughters, 3 sons, but no mother. He rakes leaves and fixes umbrellas, occasionally throws back his head and sings. Bridge called water. I wrote hard on paper at the bottom of a pool near a canyon where the stars slid onto their bellies like fish. I wrote. I went through the mountain, through the leaves of La Puente to see the moon, but too late, too long ago to walk on glass. Near those years when the house fell on me, my father told me, draw mom in bed with another man. From a plum tree, the sounds of branches fall like fruit. I'm older, no longer afraid. My voice water from a well, where someone was always running into my room asking, what's wrong? A lot of the book, um, the way or the type of writer or the type of mind or heart that I have, the structure of the poems always come at the very end. Both, and that's how the book was shaped, was that the shape of it came at the very end. And what that meant was that I integrated a lot of prose poems in the book at the very end that created the storyline that I realized that I was telling, that was about sort of my just growing older and becoming aware of some of the experiences that I had had that were a little bit traumatic. Although at the time, I don't think people even used the word trauma when they were happening. You just kind of went through them and were like, wow, I'm dreaming about this a lot. So this is one of those prose poems. Who makes love to us after we die? I turn on the radio and hear voices. I turn on the radio and hear voices. Girls becoming women after tragedy. Talk about dreams. His heart was covered in a thin shell the color of moon, and when touched, I grew old. The best movies have a philosophy. Dorothy, after being subjected to girl on girl violence, is rescued. Someone hanged himself on that set. A man who loved but couldn't have a certain woman. Management claimed it was a bird. The best movies begin with an encounter and end with someone setting someone free. In Coppola's Dracula, the camera chases women across a garden until they kiss. The man I loved after many years asked me to choke him in bed. Later, cleaning a kitchen cabinet, I found a recipe carved into the wood, and I had a hard time believing him. Amiga, we were in front of Kmart when I called your boyfriend an asshole for beating you up, and you told me if I said anything bad about him again, you'd never speak to me. Notes for white girls. Roaches bubbling out of drawers and cabinets, so many that each time a boyfriend asked for something to eat, I'd head to the kitchen, turn on the light, and squash with my hand whatever I saw running. They thought I had them sit in the living room because I liked serving them. Life as a Mexican girl and a family can feel different, sometimes like you're not part of the family. Songs of escape. Our house, 2 doors, a window that never opens. A nurse shines a penlight in each eye and nods when I answer. My hair is falling out again. The doctor doesn't know why. God does. So does Mom. I lean over a sink the color of seashells, cutting myself, proving that I can sweat into the symptom, watch the doves pour out of me. Dad traps the calico tabby that killed our bird, pushes her into a plastic bag, then into the gutter so she'll learn. I sit at the kitchen table misspelling pleas for help, people to run from, Joey Bulldog, Juice, Donito, Wolf, Silent, Bugsy, Bewilder, El Scorpion. Come winter, I sing. I carry a red flame in my nightgown pocket and am slapped until I learn to ask for softer fruit, semen, egg yolk, blood, ordinary things that girls are forced to swallow. Men are the only islands I've ever lived on. I'll never get away. I turn and sleep, but parts of me won't. They stay very still. Someone is always touching me. Easter, the sky a full-blown rose. From under the shade of a loquat tree, my Uncle Wolf says, you're writing a ghost story, a book for a man who's never going to come. I'm going to read a newer poem that was written, I think, or what I'd like to think in relationship to the my first book. I think after I was done writing my first book, I thought, oh, I don't want to actually revisit any of that material. I want to write something completely different. People won't even know it's me writing these poems. And then in the end, I had more to say. And maybe that might never end. So this is something that's connected, I believe. Okay, I'm going to open this up on my screen, so just excuse me a moment. Okay. Biography. Tell them the ones you sold weed to, who threw rocks to signal you down, went to prison. Tell them there were dreams you couldn't shut off. Tell them you struck moon because moon represented mother. Tell them you meant to keep that with the crucifixes, knitted booties, and stories of Chavez Ravine. Tell them your father broke a watermelon and took the heart. Your brother was shot. Tell them your house was shot. Then your brother shot again. Tell them your parents passed a pickled pig's foot between them and watched faces of death. Why did the Aztec want so many hearts? Tell them. Tell them after watching porn, you have yet to see a woman experience pleasure, not that kind and not that way. Tell them your uncle's heart gave out and you found him standing at the sink with a pot of eggs. Tell them you went to wake her and she disappeared. Tell them he was kind and how she said, that's abuse, and you said, no, it wasn't. Tell them he drank T-Bird, your mom did time in Sybil Brand, and the town smelled of dog food. Tell them you severed his head and searched for a place to bury it. I come from crazy, from sit the fuck down. There's a lot of stars out here. Come out, touch them. I wrote that poem in response to these biographies that you create about yourself that sort of list the journals that you've published in and you know, all of the things that sort of credential you and legitimize the work that you're doing based on what other people sort of, where they publish you. And I thought that what was missing from that was sort of the core experiences that had shaped my life. And so I decided to write that poem biography in response to that. I'm gonna now read a few more poems. And the poems talk a little bit about, but they also sort of don't actually, there's a direct address, but it's a direct address toward intimacy and not really knowledge of what actually is occurring sometimes in the poem. So you enter the poem in the middle of an argument or after an argument, and there's sort of this suspense or cloudiness around the poems, or at least that's what I was trying to do, about what could potentially happen, or what has happened. Prayer for what's in me to finally come out. I want to smoke weed on Easter and walk with my cousins up P Hill and passing 7-Eleven, look into the sweet and smoky houses of the middle class and think, you never know. I want to fade in the doorway of the house I grew up in and understand why the light in my dad's body, after the needles tucked in, is orange on a river so silver I can barely see him. I want to wear a yellow sundress in the hallway of a rented house, holding what I meant to send you that summer I bought my first car, and YA shaved my brother's head, replacing his name with a number. I want to walk P Hill before my brother was shot and the neighbors carried him in on a dining room chair to lay him on my mother's bed, where later, waking, he yelled, "Mom, bring me my pills." Desire is a road. Spend enough time on your knees and you become sacred. My father, who palmed corsets, was like this. He'd shoot up, present something brilliant in his voice, then scratch his face and proclaim, "Not here." My mother, more taken with plans and results, thought him a fine, hot like dice, hair trigger too. Whenever I asked her for advice, she'd shrug and point to the elms. I used to live over there where I stole peaches for Carmen. This is how my mother taught me the difference between desire and the sea. One is always bigger. The last poem I'm about to read is a poem that is similar to some of the other poems in the book that have to do with collage. Collage is something that I do with most of my poems. Sometimes they're numbered, sometimes they're enumerated, and other times they're not. But the key to that is sort of to get them to float on the page, but also connect, sort of like in an archipelago sense. And this is one of those poems. Late night talks with men I think I trust. He's made me smaller, taken fingernails and spoken words that force me to wake where plum trees don't give and dogs tied to houses with rope are shot through with silver. His sisters battered our door with a hatchet and telescope found at a yard sale. And a home too much green makes one lose facility. If you hear owls laughing outside your house, someone's bewitched you, Grandma warned, grabbing cats by their tails, throwing them over the fences. At night, we folded tortillas into our mouths, pulled splinters from our hands. No one spoke above the TV unless we spilled or wanted more. Through cattails, children led horses, dogs gnawed on shards of bone. We belong to these conversations. That's why it's taken me this long to write his name. I did what no one's ever done. I met my father. Thank you, everyone.
Wow, thank you. Wow, so intense. And I'm always amazed. I think this is something that I really find in poetry, but finding such beauty in trauma, even before the word trauma was used.
Yeah.
How to pull out, how to use language to illuminate those moments so clearly that it does exhibit a kind of beauty, even if it is painful. It's a remarkable thing. And I'm glad you talked about collage as kind of a process, because I was curious about that. You have for being so dreamlike, and these fragments, somehow there is this really clear narrative and a really cohesive progression. And yet, when you stop, they're dreamlike fragments. So that's also a dichotomy. You're balancing these two things. And that really makes sense when you're reflecting the stories that you're telling, which are so internal and often, especially with childhood trauma, buried, so that you do have to dig up these through layers and layers to find those pieces to even articulate them, at least in my own personal experience. And so it's an amazing thing that you can, create, the using those images, create that, those stories, and put light on them, really.
Mhm. When I think about the book, I think of it as a love story. It's a story about the relationships that we have. Some of them, you know, it's about intimacy, the relationship that I have with my father, who I love very much, and my family. But at the same time, that those relationships can be fraught. But in the end, it was attempting to write a book from a perspective of love and care, and respect. That was very important for me. Um, to the point about just this digging up or unearthing, I think that there's something hermetic about trauma, that you could be walking down the street and you realize, wait, I remembered this one thing, and it just kind of all of a sudden sort of is there for you to touch and be with again. And I think that that happened a lot while I wrote this book. I read a lot about Freud's uncanny, and that was something also that sort of plays is something that I think I was writing to that concept a lot, about this idea that it's something of the everyday, where you can be in the kitchen, but then there's stolen jewelry, but then underneath all of that there's this competitive nature between my father and my brother. So there's just a lot of different things that are at play um, when I was writing the book, because I personally didn't feel that I would really accomplish what I wanted to do if I just told beginning, middle, and end stories. And I often don't think that memory works itself out that way, and especially traumatic memories. Everything is very jagged and it comes to you scattered in pieces. It's just a non-linear, but it just courses through you in a non-linear way. So that was part of the reason why the book ended up using a lot of collage, and it wasn't something that I did intentionally from the beginning. It's just the way that I write, and I still write that way. I write in just very nonlinear. It's super frustrating for me when I'm trying to convey something in a linear way. But it's something that's just kind of like how the narrative came out. But thank you, Ellison, for sort of sharing those thoughts about the way that the book is put together. And I'm thankful too that it gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about, like, the love that I think I have for my family, and why that was important to have alongside my writing, what happened.
And I think that, that perhaps that is how some of that beauty emerges, is because the whole book, all of the narratives are threaded with love. So that love um, is part of the fabric, which is so important, because it's so, you know, pain and anger and trauma can, cover that up, and shunt down the love. And so it's a power of your, let's, like, maybe one of your superpowers, right, that you can highlight that and strengthen it throughout these stories. um Laura says trauma is something that some of us, me, do well at just forgetting and burying. Did you find the process was healing? I like that you frame the book in love.
Mm. Yeah. Um, you know, I, for a long time, I didn't know what kind of book I was writing. I would just write these particular poems, and I didn't really have control over things just because I was in the earlier years of I was finding my voice. But I knew that these characters, or sort of characterizations of my family, kept coming up. Initially, I didn't want to write about them, and I tried to write maybe about boyfriends and things like that that I had. Or I wrote a lot about those relationships when I first began writing. And then when I began to sort of follow those threads, I realized that it was going back to my father. Sherry Mordaga says in one of her books, for better or worse, the family is the first place we learn to love. And I thought about that a lot when I was writing this book, because all of it kind of was there with them, with my family. Um, I didn't really think about healing when I was writing it. I think that it did allow me to confront a lot of transgressions that I had experienced that I didn't realize that they were transgressions. But my body did. But as I became older, I was able to maybe think about them in a more critical way. And then I was able to piece together, oh, this is why this makes me feel this way, because this is what's going on. Because I think that when you're experiencing trauma, there's a big split between sort of what's going on somatically and also what's going on in your head. And I think I was able to kind of bring those two together. But I think what's healing for me is when I read the book and then other people feel that they can share things that really hurt them or that are painful, that they want to write about them. That for me is healing, because it opens up a space and it takes away the shame that many of us feel from writing about things that affect us when we are at our most vulnerable, which is when we are children. And living in a family unit where we sometimes don't have a voice, especially in sort of traditional immigrant families, which really have completely different roles, or at least I felt like my family did. I'm like semi first generation. My mom was born in Mexico, but my dad was born in the US. So it was like two different sort of generations that were coming together that I lived under.
Does anybody else have a question or comment? Um, Another thing I really love about this book is the prose poem. I love the prose poem form, and was first introduced to it when pretty young by Charles Simics writing,
Yeah.
and just opened up my mind in a really wonderful way, because it's not simply eschewing line breaks or just putting it into a paragraph. It really is a, a form that can encompass so much in that shape. And I was lucky enough to meet my hero at the U of A Poetry Center.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think he was there November 2019, I believe, or October. So, and I actually wrote an homage poem to him. uh,
Oh, that's
uh,
great.
well, I wrote it a long time ago when I was in college, but I printed it out and brought it up to Tucson and gave it to him, um, which was, kind of a dream come true. But my friend who came with me, she wrote a poem about the reading, and about me being so excited there. So, the poem within the poem, and all shaped by this new when I first read him, this idea of a prose poem or a paragraph. And I love the way you hold it so strongly, that shape, and tell your story within it. It's really, I think that sometimes with poets, um, when you make it look so easy, that it's so deceptive, the craft and the consideration put into shaping what you want to say. So I think you're remarkable at that.
Thank you so much for chatting about your experience with the prose poem. I think the prose poem for me is probably one of my favorite forms. I'm also very interested in the sonnet, but just broken. Um, uh, but I think that the prose poem, you can hide a lot of things, and you could push, you can achieve sometimes a greater degree of velocity, both in time and space, even when you consider like the fairy tale. You read a fairy tale, and Italo Calvino talks a lot about this in one of his books on crafts. I think it's Millenniums, Six Memos for the Millenniums, and he talks about fairy tale time and how you have a paragraph, but you literally can cover the course of someone's life in a fairy tale, just in a paragraph. And that always stuck with me about that ability to leap through time. But I'm more interested in emotion and feelings in my work. I'm more interested in sort of like, what level of intimacy can I achieve in a very short amount of time? And how do I get to that place? So it's about building a relationship or speaking my secret to that person in a very close proximity. And I love the prose poem for that. I think that it's something that I really enjoy working with, and I've continued to work with. The poem Biography that I read is actually a prose poem. It's kind of like a bigger version than I would normally do, but a newer project too that I'm working on, it's primarily prose poems.
Well, maybe you could join us next April in person if things go well, and lead a poetry workshop as well. And it makes sense that you mentioned Calvino, because Calvino also has those dreamlike fragments that magically cohere into a very clear narrative, but you're not sure how, because he has reached other parts of your brain which
Yeah.
are accessed in that dream space, or that moment between wait sleeping and waking, dreaming
Mhm.
and being conscious. And I think you have that. And also another thing, you mentioned emotion and like really accessing these emotions, but you have such concrete images, these really specific objects, and yet each one of those objects holds a whole story and captures a whole emotional range by being in the space of that, inanimate object. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I studied for a bit earlier on with Lourdes de Cervantes, and one of the things that she talked about was sort of know your symbols and know what they actually mean. And what I realized, maybe far too late, is like this idea of the moon, this idea of the stars, a lot that comes up a lot in the book. And some of it has to do with um, me without being aware of it, but just sort of acknowledging that the littleness of the voice, or the vulnerability of being able to look up at the stars and creating a voice that's more diminutive in relation to like the cosmos. And sort of, so there's a lot of sort of me uh, as the speaker, sort of like looking into the sky, or observing things that are going on in the sky. And I think just some of that has to do with not only the stars as a symbol of sort of like how little we are, but also just of like the vulnerability of sort of looking for something. And I talk a little bit about that too, where I say, strike every reference of moon. Moon represents my mother. Um, so there is this looking for this sort of figure. often in the book.
Well, and it's also night. It's so
Yeah,
many times it's at night, and night is when the secrets happen and things are covered up. And so it really does place place you with that voice
yeah.
and that. Um, does anybody else have a question or comment before we end?
I was just going to say, this is just sort of an aside that as someone who is not an immigrant and is about as white as somebody can be, uh, as a youth, I had no voice in my family. It's not just an immigrant thing.
I think,
I think
yeah,
it's a family dysfunctional thing.
yeah, for sure. Thanks for that sort of note. I think it can happen across cultures. I think though that for me though, I felt it even more so because coming from a Mexican American family, the way, you know, your positions are just very aligned, or sort of set up. Um, they're predetermined, I guess is what I'm saying. That's not to say that
Yeah.
in other cultures, but there's very sort of like the father is sort of the person that tells everyone what to do. The kids follow, you know, so it's just, and that, but I think you're right. I think that that could happen in many cultures, right?
Right.
I think I just felt it more powerfully because my mother was also somebody who she really couldn't read or write. She didn't graduate from high school. So there was just like a lot of sort of barriers to sort of that adequacy that can happen potentially much sooner with people who know the language and are able to, I mean, my mother speaks perfect English now, but I think at the time, you know, she had come, I think when she was maybe like 6 or 7 or something like that. But it was like a different education. It was a class thing. So it's just, but I agree with you. I think it can happen in many families.
Right. And having, as I said that, I realized I didn't want you to think that I was sort of downgrading the cultural aspects of what you were talking about, because I obviously can't speak to that. And I didn't want to sound like I was belittling that, but you know, as someone who came from, you know, a non-immigrant family, it was very the same thing. You know, maybe just iterated in a different way, but
yeah, no, I believe that. I think that
Yeah.
I often talk to many people who say that they had a very similar experience. And that's not the only, you know, it's not the worst thing that could also happen, right? But it was something that was significant for me because I think that I always knew I wanted to be a writer and I was always reading. So that was also significant for me to kind of, I was just watching all of the time. And just sort of knowing that at some point I was going to figure it out and I guess be in writing.
Well, one other thing, and I don't want to dominate the last couple of minutes of what we're doing here, but I would also say that when you do come from a dysfunctional family, especially one that's with a violent core, which I unfortunately I came in late, but that's what I was hearing in your poem. I think you also learn to observe and listen out of necessity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think you do. I think you also learn to recognize the expressions of someone's face, right? Especially if somebody is able to go from you're just having a conversation with them to becoming very angry very quickly. I know that that's children who have suffered, you know, traumatic experiences, they're able to read people's expression very quickly.
Right.
Just with lightning like that, because they're watching to see what this person is sort of like, what the next sort of
what the next move is.
Yeah, and they want to be ready. And I just think that that's something that happens. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and that supervigilance can be really exhausting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that is kind of that other thing I was saying about, you know, having such intimate personal stories, but that overlap other people's experiences, even if they didn't come from the same background,
Yeah.
whether it's dysfunctional family or trauma or being a woman in a very male cultural dynamic, family dynamic. But in each case, you know, to find that connection that that by telling your story, you're you're giving a gift of access to, so that for those who aren't able to speak, it's almost it- it's like giving a voice to the voiceless. It's empowering. And when an individual like myself or other readers can feel so intimately close to it, knowing what you're talking about, that too is a gift, right? Because then we're not as alone as we thought we were.
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, that's, I think that um I'm thankful that the book does that. I didn't try to do that. It was just something that happened. So I'm thankful that it does do that, because it's great to have the book serve as like a connection to other people who've had similar experiences, that just really sort of crosses time, gender, cultural, cultural identity.
Yeah, I you definitely have done it. And it is beautiful, Diana. It is a really beautiful book too. And so that is, I think, another important gift to remember, that it's not all darkness and we don't come out into only light. It's always going to be complicated. It's
Yeah.
always going to be multifaceted and fraught. But I think Laura, you know, even asking the question, did you find the process was healing? It's almost, there's a sense of healing in reading it, right? For as part of that intimate experience of, I love poetry, can you tell? So thank you, Sharon, for your insight as well. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Diana, the Copper Queen Library, and myself, we hope to have you back in hopefully in April. And also everybody, Diana does work at the U of A Poetry Center, one of my favorite places, not just in the state, but in the country and the world. It is a remarkable place, and has so many online resources as well as programs, and the collection, not just the poetry collection, but the artist books and the poetry art that is in the permanent collection there too. So I highly recommend going up there.
Yeah, one last thing, just we have a Voca archive that has poetry readings dating back from like 1963, of all the poetry readings that have ever happened really at the Poetry Center. So that's also a really great resource. We have that archive, and we have, I think, about 25,000 books of contemporary poetry, non-circulating, but we still have that there, along with a rare books archive and ongoing seasonal exhibitions that the library puts on. So definitely worth a trip from Bisbee.
Yeah, it is. And they have archived the Bisbee Poetry Festival as well. That has been archived, and from 1980 to 84, I think, and then the early 90s. So there is that connection there. So we really appreciate your work there, but as well as you as a poet. And thank you everybody for coming. And
Thank you.
remember to introduce a little poetry into your life every day, whether reading or writing, or just simply looking up as you stand in the world and noticing the details. It makes a difference. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Have
Thank
a good
you.
Thank
night.
you.
Okay, have a good night.
You too.